Hey comrades, so today we're finishing chapter 3 of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. For if you think that you can manage a country without letting the people interfere, if you think that the people upset the game by their mere presence, whether they slow it down or whether they, by their natural ignorance, they sabotage it, then you must have no hesitation. You must keep the people out. Now it so happens that when the people are invited to partake in the management of the country, they do not slow down the movement, but on the contrary, they speed it up. We Algerians have had the occasion and the good fortune during the course of this war to handle a fair number of questions. In certain country districts, the politico-military leaders of the revolution found themselves in fact confronted with situations which called for radical solutions. We shall look at some of these situations. During the years 1956 to 57, French colonialism had marked off certain zones as forbidden, and within these zones, people's movements were strictly controlled. Thus, the peasants could no longer go freely to the towns and buy provisions. During this period, the grocers made huge profits. The prices of tea, coffee, sugar, tobacco, and salt soared. The black market flourished blatantly. The peasants who could not pay in money mortgaged their crops, in other words, their land, or else lopped off field after field of their fathers' farms, and during the second phase worked them for the grocer. As soon as the political commissioners realized the danger of the situation, they reacted immediately. Thus, a rational system of provisioning was instituted. The grocer who went to the town was obliged to buy from nationalist wholesalers, who handed him an invoice which clearly showed the price of the goods. When the retailer got back to the village, before doing anything else, he had to go to the political commissioner, who checked the invoice, decided on the margin of profit, and fixed the price at which the various goods should be sold. However, the retailer soon discovered a new trick, and after 3 or 4 days declared that his stocks had run out. In fact, he went on with his business of selling the black market on the sly. The reaction of the politico-military authorities was thoroughgoing. Heavy penalizations were decided on, and the fines collected were put into the village funds and used for social purposes or to pay for public works in the general interest. Sometimes it was decided to shut down the shop for a while. Then, if there was a reputation of black marketeering, the business was at once confiscated and a managed committee elected to carry it on, which paid a monthly allowance to the former owner. Taking these experiences as a starting point, the functioning of the main laws of economics was explained to the people, with concrete examples. The accumulation of capital ceased to be a theory and became a very real and immediate mode of behavior. The people understood how that once a man was in trade, he could become rich and increase his turnover. Then, and only then, did the peasants tell the tale of how the grocer gave them loans at exorbitant interest, and the others recalled how he evicted them from their land, and how from owners they became laborers. The more the people understand, the more watchful they become, and the more they come to realize that finally everything depends on them, and their salvation lies in their own cohesion, in the true understanding of their interests, and in knowing who their enemies are. The people come to understand that wealth is not the fruit of labor, but the result of organized, protected robbery. Rich people are no longer respectable people. They are nothing more than flesh-eating animals, jackals and vultures, which wallow in the people's blood. With another end in view, the political commissioners have had to decide that nobody will work for anyone else any longer. The land belongs to those that till it. This is a principle which has through explanation become a fundamental law of Algerian revolution. The peasants who used to employ agricultural laborers have been obliged to give a share of the land to their former employees. So it may be seen that production per acre trembled in spite of the many raids by the French, in spite of bombardments from the air, and the difficulty of getting manures. The fellahs, who at harvest time were able to judge and weigh the crops thus obtained, wanted to know whence came such a phenomenon, and they were quick to understand that the idea of work is not as simple as all that. that slavery is opposed to work, and that work presupposes liberty, responsibility, and consciousness. In those districts where we have been able to carry out successfully these interesting experiments, where we have watched man being created by revolutionary beginnings, the peasants have very clearly caught hold of the idea that the more intelligence you bring to your work, the more pleasure you will have in it. We have been able to make the masses understand that work is not simply the output of energy, nor the functioning of certain muscles, but that people work more by using their brains and their hearts than only their muscles and their sweat. In the same way, in these liberated districts, which are at the same time excluded from the old trade routes, we have had to modify production, which formerly looked only toward the town and toward export. We have organized production to meet consumers' needs for the people and for the units of the National Army of Liberation. We have quadrupled the production of lentils and organized the manufacture of charcoal. Green vegetables and charcoal have been sent through the mountains from the north to the south, whereas the southern districts send meat to the north. This coordination was decided upon by the FLN, and it was they who set up the system of communications. We did not have any technicians or planners coming from big Western universities, but in these liberated regions, the daily ration went up to the hitherto unheard of figure of 3,200 calories. The people were not content with coming triumphant out of this test. They started asking themselves theoretical questions. For example, why did certain districts never see an orange before the War of Liberation, while thousands of tons are exported every year abroad? Why were grapes unknown to a great many Algerians, whereas the European peoples enjoyed them by the million? Today, the people have a very clear notion of what belongs to them. The Algerian people today know that they are the sole owners of the soil and mineral wealth of their country, and if some individuals do not understand the unrelenting refusal of the FLN to tolerate any encroachment on this right of ownership, and its fierce refusal to allow any compromise on the principles, they must one and all remember that the Algerian people is today an adult people, responsible and fully conscious of its responsibilities. In short, the Algerians are men of property. If we have taken the example of Algeria to illustrate our subject, it is not at all with the intention of glorifying our own people, but simply to show the important part played by the war in leading them toward consciousness of themselves. It is clear that other peoples have come to the same conclusion in different ways. We know for sure today that in Algeria the test of force was inevitable, but in other countries through political action and through the work of clarification undertaken by a party have led their people to the same results. In Algeria, we have realized that the masses are equal to the problems which confront them. In an underdeveloped country, experience proves that the important thing is not that 300 people form a plan and decide upon carrying it out, but that the whole people plan and decide, even if it takes them twice or 3 times as long. The fact is that the time taken up by explaining the time quote-unquote lost in treating the worker as a human being will be caught up in the execution of the plan. People must know where they are going, and why. The politician should not ignore the fact that the future remains a closed book so long as the consciousness of the people remains imperfect, elementary, and cloudy. We African politicians must have very clear ideas on the situation of our people, but this clarity of ideas must be profoundly dialectical. The awakening of the whole people will not come about all at once. The people's work in the building up of the nation will not immediately take on its full dimensions. First, because the means of communication and transmission are only beginning to be developed. Secondly, because the yardstick of time must no longer be that of the moment or up till the next harvest, but must become that of the rest of the world, and lastly become the spirit of discouragement, which has been deeply rooted in people's mind by the colonial domination, is still very near the surface. But we must not overlook the fact that the victory over those weaknesses, which are the heritage of the material and spiritual domination of the country by another, is a necessity from which no government will be able to escape. Let us take the example of work under the colonial regime. The settler never stopped complaining that the native is slow. Today, in certain countries which have become independent, we hear the ruling classes taking up the same cry. The fact is that the settler wanted the native to be enthusiastic. By a sort of process of mystification which constitutes the most sublime type of separation from reality, he wanted to persuade the slave that the land that he worked belonged to him, that the mines where he lost his health were owed to him. The settler was singularly forgetful of the fact that he was growing rich through the death throes of the slave. In fact, what the settler was saying to the native was, quote, "Kill yourself that I may become rich." End quote. Today, we must behave in a different fashion. We ought not to say to the people, "Kill yourselves that the country may become rich," if we want to increase the national revenue and decrease the importing of certain products which are useless or even harmful. If we want to increase agricultural production and overcome illiteracy, we must explain what we are about. These people must understand what is at stake. Public business ought to be the business of the public. So the necessity of creating a large number of well-informed nuclei at the bottom crops up again too. Too often, in fact, we are content to establish national organizations at the top and always in the capital. The Women's Union, the Young People's Federation, trade unions, etc. But if one takes the trouble to investigate what is behind the office in the capital, you go into the inner room, whereas the reports ought to be, you will be shocked by the emptiness, the blank spaces, and the bluff. There must be a basis. There must be cells that supply content and life. The masses should be able to meet together, discuss, propose, and receive directions. The citizens should be able to speak, to express themselves, and to put forward new ideas. The branch meeting and the committee meeting are liturgical acts. They are privileged occasions given to a human being to listen and to speak. At each meeting, the brain increases its means of participation, and the eye discovers a landscape more and more in keeping with human dignity. The large proportion of young people in the underdeveloped countries raises specific problems for the government which must be tackled with lucidity. The young people of the towns, idle and often illiterate, are a prey to all sorts of disintegrating influences. It is to the youth of underdeveloped countries that the industrialized countries most often offer their pastimes. Normally, there is a certain homogeneity between the mental and material level of the members of any given society and the pleasures which that society creates for itself. But in underdeveloped countries, young people have at their disposition leisure occupations designed for the youth of capitalist countries. Detective novels, penny in the slot machines, sexy photographs, pornographic literature, films banned to those under 16, and above all, alcohol. In the West, the family circle, the effects of education, and the relatively high standard of living of the working classes provided a more or less efficient protection against the harmful action of these pastimes. But in an African country, where the mental development is uneven, where the violent collision of two worlds has considerably shaken old traditions and thrown the universe of the perceptions out of focus, the impressionability and sensibility of the young African are at the mercy of the various assaults made upon them by the very nature of Western culture. His family very often proves itself incapable of showing stability and homogeneity when faced with such attacks. In this domain, the government's duty is to act as a filter and a stabilizer, but the youth commissioners in underdeveloped countries often make the mistake of imagining their role to be that of youth commissioners in fully developed countries. They speak of strengthening the soul, of developing the body, and of facilitating the growth of sportsmanlike qualities. It is our opinion that they should beware of these conceptions. The young people of underdeveloped country are above all idle. Occupations must be found for them. For this reason, the youth commissioners ought for practical purposes to be attached to the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor, which is a prime necessity in an underdeveloped country, functions in collaboration with the Ministry of Planning, which is another necessary institution in underdeveloped countries. The youth of Africa ought not to be sent sports stadiums, but into the fields and into the schools. The stadium ought not to be a show place erected in the towns, but a bit of open ground in the midst of the fields that the young people must reclaim, cultivate, and give to the nation. The capitalist conception of sport is fundamentally different from that which should exist in an underdeveloped country. The African population should not be preoccupied with turning out sportsmen, but with turning out fully conscious men who play games as well. If games are not integrated into the national life, that is to say, in the building of a nation, and if you turn out national sportsmen and not fully conscious men, you will very quickly see sport rotted by professionalism and commercialism. Sport should not be a pastime or a distraction for the bourgeoisie of the towns. The greatest task before us is to understand at each moment what is happening in our country. We ought not to cultivate the exceptional or to seek for a hero who is another form of leader. We ought to uplift the people. We must develop their brains, fill them with ideas, change them and make them into human beings. We once more come up against that obsession of ours, which we would like to see shared by all African politicians about the need for effort to be well informed, for work which is enlightened and freed from its historic intellectual darkness. To hold a responsible position in an underdeveloped country is to know that in the end, everything depends on the education of the masses, on the raising of the level of thought, and on what we are too quick to call quote-unquote political teaching. In fact, we often believe with criminal superficiality that to educate the masses politically is to deliver a long political harangue from time to time. We think that it is enough that the leader or one of his lieutenants should speak in a pompous tone about the principal events of the day for them to have fulfilled this boudin duty to educate the masses politically. Now, political education means opening their minds, awakening them, and allowing the birth of their intelligence. As Césaire said, it is, quote, to invent souls, end quote. To educate the masses politically cannot mean making a political speech. What it means is to try, relentlessly and passionately, to teach the masses that everything depends on them, that if we stagnate, it is their responsibility, and if we go forward, it is due to them, too. That there is no such thing as a demiurge, that there is no famous man who will take the responsibility for everything, but that the demiurge is the people themselves, and the magic hands are finally only the hands of the people. In order to pull all this into practice, in order to really incarnate the people, we repeat that there must be decentralization in the extreme. The movement from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top should be a fixed principle, not through concern for formalism, but because simply to respect this principle is a guarantee of salvation. It is from the base that forces mount up which supply the summit with its dynamic and make it possible dialectically for it to leap ahead. Once again, we Algerians have been quick to understand these facts, for no member of the government at the head of any recognized state has had the chance of availing himself of such a mission of salvation. For it is the rank and file who are fighting in Algeria, and the rank and file know well that without their daily struggle, hard and heroic as it is, the summit would collapse, and in the same way, those at the bottom know that without a head, and without leadership, that the base would split apart in incoherence and anarchy. The summit only draws its worth and its strength from the existence of the people at war. Literally, it is the people who freely create a summit for themselves, and not the summit that tolerates the people. The masses should know that the government and their party are at their service. A deserving people, in other words, a people conscious of its dignity, is a people that never forgets these facts. During the colonial occupation, the people were told that they must give their lives so that dignity might triumph. But the African peoples quickly came to understand that it was not only the occupying power that threatened their dignity. The African peoples were quick to realize that dignity and sovereignty were exact equivalents, and in fact, a free people living in dignity is a sovereign people. It is no use demonstrating that African peoples are childish or weak. A government or party gets the people it deserves, and sooner or later, a people gets the government it deserves. Practical experience in certain regions confirms this point of view. It sometimes happens at meetings that militants use sweeping dogmatic formulas. The preference for this shortcut, in which spontaneity and over-simple sinking of differences dangerously combine to defeat intellectual elaboration frequently triumphs. When we meet this shirking responsibility in a militant, it is not enough to tell him he is wrong. We must make him ready for responsibility, encourage him to follow up his chain of reasoning, and make him realize the true nature, often shocking, inhuman, and in the long run sterile, of such oversimplification. Nobody, neither the leader nor rank-and-filer, can hold back the truth. The search for truth in local attitudes is a collective affair. Some are richer in experience and elaborate their thought more rapidly, and in the past have been able to establish a greater number of mental links, but they ought to avoid riding roughshod over the people, for the success of the decision which is adopted depends on the coordinated, conscious effort of the whole of the people. No one can get out of the situation scot-free. Everyone will be butchered or tortured. In the framework of the independent nation, everyone will go hungry, and everyone will suffer in the slump. The collective struggle presupposes collective responsibility at the base and collegiate responsibility at the top. Yes, everybody will have to be compromised in the fight for the common good. No one has clean hands. There are no innocents and no onlookers. We have dirty hands. We are all soiling them in the swamps of our country and in the terrifying emptiness of our brains. Every onlooker is either a coward or a traitor. The duty of those at the head of the movement is to have the masses behind them. Allegiance presupposes awareness and understanding of the mission which has to be fulfilled. In short, an intellectual position. However embryonic, we must not voodoo the people nor dissolve them in emotion and confusion. Only those underdeveloped countries led by revolutionary elite who have come up from the people can today allow the entry of the masses upon the scene of history. But we must repeat, it is absolutely necessary to oppose vigorously and definitively the birth of a national bourgeoisie and a privileged caste. To educate the masses politically is to make the totality of the nation a reality to each citizen. It is to make the history of the nation part of the personal experience of each of its citizens. As President Sekou Touré aptly remarked in his message to the Second Congress of African Writers, quote, "In the realm of thought, man may claim to be the brain of the world, but in real life, where every action affects spiritual and physical existence, the world is always the brain of mankind. For it is at this level you will find the sum total of the powers and units of thought and the dynamic forces of development and improvement, and it is there that energies are merged and the sum of man's intellectual values is finally added together." End quote. Individual experience, because it is national and because it is a link in the chain of national existence, ceases to be individual, limited, and shrunken, and is enabled to open out into the truth of the nation and of the world. In the same way that during the period of armed struggle each fighter held the fortune of the nation in his hand, so during the period of national construction each citizen ought to continue in his real everyday activity to associate himself with the whole of the nation, to incarnate the continuous dialectical truth of the nation, and to will the triumph of man in his completeness here and now. If the building of a bridge does not enrich the awareness of those who work on it, then the bridge ought not to be built, and the citizens can go on swimming across the river or going by boat. The bridge should not be, quote-unquote, parachuted down from above. It should not be imposed by a deus ex machina upon a social scene. On the contrary, it should come from the muscles and the brains of the citizen. Certainly, there may well be need of engineers and architects, sometimes completely foreign engineers and architects, but the local party leaders should be always present so that the new techniques can make their way into the cerebral desert of the citizen, so that the bridge in the whole and in part can be taken up and conceived, and the responsibility for it assumed by the citizen. In this way, and in this way only, everything is possible. A government which calls itself a national government ought to take responsibility for the totality of the nation, and in an underdeveloped country the young people represent one of the most important sectors. The level of consciousness of young people must be raised. They need enlightenment. If the work of explanation has been carried on among the youth of the nation, and if the Young People's National Union has carried out its task of integrating them into the nation, those mistakes would have been avoided which have threatened or already undermined the future of Latin American republics. The army is not always a school of war. More often, it is a school of civic and political education. The soldier of an adult nation is not a simple mercenary, but a citizen who by means of arms defends the nation. That is why it is of fundamental importance that the soldier should know that he is in the service of his country, and not in the service of his commanding officer, however great that officer's prestige may be. We must take advantage of the national military and civil service in order to raise the level of national consciousness, and to detribalize and unite the nation. In an underdeveloped country, every effort is made to mobilize men and women as quickly as possible. It must guard against the danger of perpetuating the feudal tradition which holds sacred the superiority of the masculine element over the feminine. Women will have exactly the same place as men, not in the clauses of the Constitution, but in the life of every day, in the factory, at school, and in the Parliament. If in the Western countries men are shut up in the barracks, that is not to say that this is always the best procedure. Recruits need not necessarily be militarized. The national service may be civil or military, and in any case it is advisable that every able-bodied citizen can, at any moment, take his place in a fighting unit for the defense of national and social liberties. It should be possible to carry out large-scale undertakings in the public interest by using recruited labor. This is a marvelous way of stirring up inert districts and of making known to a great number of citizens the needs of their country. Care must be taken to avoid turning the army into an autonomous body which sooner or later, finding itself idle and without any definite mission, will, quote-unquote, go into politics and threaten the government. Drawing-room generals, by dint of haunting the corridors of government departments, come to dream of manifestos. The only way to avoid this menace is to educate the army politically, in other words, to nationalize it. In the same way, another urgent task is to increase the militia. In case of war, it is the whole nation which fights and works. It should not include any professional soldiers, and the number of permanent officers should be reduced to a minimum. This is in the first place because officers are very often chosen from the university class who would be much more useful elsewhere. An engineer is 1,000 times more indispensable to his country than an officer. And secondly, because the crystallization of the caste spirit must be avoided. We have seen in the preceding pages that nationalism, that magnificent song that made the people rise against their oppressors, stops short, falters, and dies away on the day that independence is proclaimed. Nationalism is not a political doctrine nor a program. If you really wish your country to avoid regression or at best halts and uncertainties, a rapid step must be taken from national consciousness to political and social consciousness. The nation does not exist in a program which has been worked out by revolutionary leaders and taken up with full understanding and enthusiasm by the masses. The nation's effort must constantly be adjusted to the general background of underdeveloped countries. The battle line against hunger, against ignorance, against poverty, and against unawareness ought to be ever present in the muscles and the intelligences of men and women. The work of the masses and their will to overcome the evils which have for centuries excluded them from the mental achievements of the past ought to be grafted onto the work and will of all underdeveloped peoples. On the level of underdeveloped humanity there is a kind of collective effort, a sort of common destiny. The news which interests the Third World does not deal with King Baudouin's marriage, nor the scandals of the Italian ruling class. What we want to hear about are the experiments carried out by the Argentinians or the Burmese in their efforts to overcome illiteracy, or in the dictatorial tendencies of their leaders. It is these things which strengthen us, teach us, and increase our efficiency 10 times over. As we see it, a program is necessary for a government which really wants to free the people politically and socially. There must be an economic program. There must also be a doctrine concerning the division of wealth and social relations. In fact, there must be an idea of man and of the future of humanity. That is to say that no demagogic formula and no collusion with the former occupying power can take place of the program. The new peoples, unawakened at first, but soon becoming more and more clear-minded, will make strong demands for this program. The African people, and indeed all underdeveloped peoples, contrary to common belief, very quickly build up social and political consciousness. What can be dangerous is when they reach the stage of social consciousness before the stage of nationalism. If this happens, we find in underdeveloped countries fierce demands for social justice which paradoxically are aligned with often primitive tribalism. The underdeveloped peoples behave like starving creatures. This means that the end is very near for those who are having a good time in Africa. Their government will not be able to prolong its own existence indefinitely. A bourgeoisie that provides nationalism alone, also food for the masses, fails in its mission and gets caught up in a whole series of mishaps. But if nationalism is not made explicit, if it is not enriched and deepened by a very rapid transformation into a consciousness of social and political needs, in other words, into humanism, it leads up a blind alley. The bourgeois leaders of undeveloped countries imprison national consciousness in sterile formalism. It is only when men and women are included on a vast scale in enlightened and fruitful work that form a body are given to that consciousness. Then the flag and the palace where sits the government cease to be symbols of the nation. The nation deserts these brightly lit empty shells and takes shelter in the country where it has given life and dynamic power. The living expression of the nation is the moving consciousness of the whole of the people. It is the coherent, enlightened action of men and women. The collective building up of a density is the assumption of responsibility on the historical scale. Otherwise, there is anarchy, repression, and the resurgence of tribal parties and federalism. The national government, if it wants to be national, ought to govern by the people and for the people, for the outcasts and by the outcasts. No leader, however valuable he may be, can substitute himself for the popular will and the national government before concerning itself about international prestige, ought first to give back their dignity to all citizens, fill their minds and feast their eyes with human things, and create a prospect that is human because conscious and sovereign men dwell therein. So that is the end of chapter 3 of The Wretched of the Earth.